Good morning, everyone. I am so excited to be here today. My name is Xavier Ramey. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer of Justice Informed, a social impact consulting firm based in the city of Chicago. I am really honored to be here today with this esteemed panel. I'm also very excited to introduce our co-host, our City Treasurer, Melissa Conyears-Ervin, as well as our Illinois State Treasurer, the Honorable Michael Frerichs. Today is going to be really exciting, you all. We're going to be jumping into this question of what does racial equity mean in the modern day in light of the work of Juneteenth being made a federal holiday or a public holiday just 2 years ago in 2021. But now we're faced with this question of what will it become? Will it be a memorial? Will it be a celebration? Will it be about economic inclusion? Will it have any of the work of the past, the harms specifically that were visited upon African-American descendants of slaves? Will that be part of the way in which we commemorate this? And where and how does racial equity in the economic landscape of America, and specifically throughout the state of Illinois and in Chicago, fit into that? We're joined by several of our esteemed bank colleagues, people who've been participating in the Advancing Equity in Banking Commission program since its inception back in 2020, in the dawn of the days after George Floyd was first killed. We are here today to talk about what this means and what this can mean for you all. Because of that, we want to make sure that we provide space for questions and answers with our panelists, as well as remarks from our two treasurers. So I'd like to hand over the mic right now to our wonderful, the Honorable City Treasurer, Melissa Conyears-Ervin, for her opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Xavier, for that introduction. And thank you for the work that you all are doing at Justice Informed. Such great work that is needed even today as we welcome our attendees to the Advancing Equity in Banking, the fourth annual event. I am Chicago City Treasurer Melissa Conyears-Ervin, and I am so happy to be joining us. Really, I still call it the Juneteenth holiday as we celebrated it on yesterday. It has been 2 years since we first celebrated Juneteenth as a federal holiday. And each year, even many more Americans have come to really know what it commemorates. June 19th, 1865, when the last group of enslaved Americans in Texas were finally informed that the Civil War was over and that they had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, 2 years prior. So you really can understand why Juneteenth has long been a sacred day for Black Americans, because it represents freedom. But while every American today is free to fully participate and receive the benefits of our economy, not every community has gotten a share of the prosperity. And this is especially true for Black and Brown Americans who are too often shut out of the financial system because of systemic discrimination. Now, the wealth and income disparities between white and minority households are a consequence of the unequal access and treatment that minorities have faced. And this injustice and others really came to light during the pandemic, and really from a 2020 study by WBEZ, which reported that between 2012 and 2018, lenders had invested more in mortgages in a single white neighborhood in Chicago than they had in all Black neighborhoods in Chicago combined. And every time I speak about that, it's still alarming to me. We saw banks leaving Black neighborhoods and the failure of banks to invest in Black communities. And with the boarded up homes and abandoned buildings, we'd see really on our daily commutes, as well as the stories that we'd hear from our friends and families trying to get a loan. And none of this came to a surprise for us who live in those neighborhoods, but it was still nonetheless shocking. Now, we already know that people are too often turning to predatory lenders and payday loan centers, and that the workforce at financial institutions do not necessarily represent the diversity of our country, even though there's plenty of minority talent. Some of you may remember the story about Ryan Coogler. He was the director of Black Panther. He was trying to withdraw money from his own bank account and gave the teller his ID, PIN number, and bank card. And still, the teller assumed that Mr. Kluger was trying to rob the bank. So, really, even wealth and fame do not necessarily stop discrimination. Another report found that Black and Latino consumers were required to maintain a minimum account balance of $821 and $879, respectively, compared to a minimum balance of $648 for white consumers. And because access to financial services is how families build wealth and a stable future, discrimination in banking only worsens the racial wealth gap, which is why State Treasurer Michael Frerichs and we came together and said, we really have to do something about this. We asked the leaders of major banks in Illinois to join us in committing to examining policies and practices in three key areas: lending, talent acquisition, and community investment. We asked them to work toward meaningful changes that will lead to greater diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the banks represented here today answered that call. And the Advancing Equity in Banking Commission was born. Now, over the following 3 years, the commission has engaged in very serious and challenging work of assessing, evaluating, and designing real change. Now, today, we will learn what progress has been made, of the new challenges being confronted, and how we get more done. And there is yet more work to be done. While the banks here today are committed to doing the work, we will continue to hold them accountable. And I hope that you would join us in doing the same. So, before we begin our discussion, I'd like to now invite my partner, Illinois State Treasurer Michael Frerichs, to share his thoughts and give us opening remarks at this time.
Great. Thank you, Treasurer Conyears-Ervin, for your remarks and for partnering with our office for this important and much needed conversation. I also want to extend gratitude to our banking partners here today. Thank you for staying with us on this journey, and happy Juneteenth. I also need to give some apologies here. When we started this 2 years ago, I was very excited. When we had our 1 year anniversary, I was a little busy getting married around this time of year. And this year, as you notice, the shelves behind me are bare. I have recently moved homes, but my books are still in boxes because last Tuesday, 1 week ago today, my wife delivered an emergency C-section to our new twins 1 week ago. So these little wristbands here are the reason the shelves behind me have not yet been filled. So things have been a little busy, but I am very excited to be here virtually today. You've already been given a wonderful overview of the significance of Juneteenth and what it commemorates. What I want to hold up is that a great Illinoisan named Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on September the 22nd, 1862. And on January 1st, 1863, all of those who were enslaved at that time were officially set free. I was unable to unpack all of my books, but I think you can see over my shoulder here, I do have a bookend for Abraham Lincoln over my corner as a reminder. Now, although he signed that and went into effect in January of 1863, for 2.5 years, those in Texas were supposed to be free, yet did not reap the benefits of their freedom. And I think it's important to frame this conversation and my remarks in this way. Being free, yet not being able to benefit from that freedom, is really not freedom at all. For those who were formerly enslaved were freed from bondage and free to reap the same benefits as all other Americans. They were free to care for their communities. They were free to marry and to reunite their families. They were free to elect their representatives and attend institutions of higher learning. And if they had been granted their 40 acres and a mule, they could have been free to care for land that they owned and could have passed down generational wealth. Today, I want to talk about the loss of generational wealth and the racial wealth gap that plagues our communities today. According to a report by the Chicago Community Trust, for every $1 of wealth accumulated by white families, Latino families have 8 cents and Black families just 1 cent. of the top 10 metropolitan areas in the United States, Chicago's population growth is far behind, and our economic growth ranks 80th among the country's 100 largest metropolitan economies. There are some estimates that our region would gain $4.4 billion annually, and the gross domestic product would rise by about $8 billion if the region were less economically segregated and more financially equitable. Far too many Chicago communities have suffered decades of disinvestment, and as such, have been unable to reach their full potential. According to Angela Fontes of the Financial Health Network, our findings support the idea that the vast gaps in financial health across Chicago and Cook County are evidence of systemic barriers that prevent financial security and perpetuate inequality. We cannot expect Cook County or other counties in Illinois to thrive when 2/3 of the population are locked out from financial equity. For us to fix financial disparities, we are going to have to be creative by using a multifaceted strategy to address the immediate needs of Black and Brown people throughout the state of Illinois. These strategies must also address long-standing barriers to wealth creation. Today, we invite you, the banking industry, to dream with us as we, treasurers, imagine a better future. Imagine if all the CEOs convened the appraisal industry and the assessor's office and CDFIs and community developers to address decades of financial harm through a racial equity lens to repair that harm. What kind of economic environment could we create together? What if together we could escape the notion of the zero-sum game and embrace the possibility of all ships rising together? We in Illinois want to lead the way by bringing the banking industry, government, and community together to address decades of financial inequities. Together, we want to highlight barriers to career advancement, lending and community investment for Black and Brown people within the banking industry, and to find innovative solutions to address these barriers. Last year, we presented a list of recommendations based on a series of conversations our offices had with our banking partners. We created a collaborative space to learn from our banking partners about their success and their challenges. Based on what we learned, we, along with Justice Informed, shared those recommendations, which are available on our respective websites if you're interested in reading about them. But today, we want to learn if those recommendations have been implemented or inspired some of the new programs we've been hearing about over the last year. We know that the banking industry is just one piece of the puzzle. We know that when it comes to home ownership, that there will also need to be changes in the real estate industry and the appraisal industry. The Advancing Equity in Banking Commission is an important entity for ensuring accountability and tracking progress made by the banks as they've agreed to do their part. We have heard over the years that this is a big lift and that it will take time. We also heard our banking leaders say that they have achieved a lot, but there is so much more to do. We agree. And today we're looking forward to hearing from them to chart our path forward. And with that, Xavier, I'd like to turn it over to you to kick off this conversation with our banking partners who have joined us today.
Thank you so much, Treasurer Frerichs, and thank you so much, Treasurer Melissa Conyears-Ervin. I want to provide a little bit of framing today about why Juneteenth is so important, how the economic ideas and ideals of America can come more alive by understanding the nuances, not just of the time of Juneteenth in 1865, which is also known as Jubilee Day, but also in the modern era here in 2023. The first thing I want to just say is that it's important for us to consider and to lock in on what should Juneteenth mean to us. I said this a little bit in my opening remarks, but I want to go into it a little bit more in detail. When African descendants of slaves were released on that day in 1865, they were not released to a world that was ready to embrace them. They were not released to an America that was ready to include them. They were not released to jobs that were waiting to hire them. They were not released to communities that wanted them to live in there and have housing there. They were released into an ecosystem of racial caste making. They were released into a world that still was debating about whether they were even 100% human. The Supreme Court had authorized that Black people were still only 3/5 of a person. And even that was only for economic gains, for specifically white persons, to ensure that they could have certain benefits on their taxes on the bodies of those slaves. The reality is that when Juneteenth was first kicked off, it was kicked off as a celebration. It was kicked off as a celebration of Black people coming together and saying, we will be in Jubilee. We will be in a moment of celebration for our freedom. And so the first thing I want to remind everyone as we are in this Juneteenth weekend is that you should have some celebration in your heart. You should have some joy in your heart. You should have some pep in your step, not because America is more free, but because freedom and joy and celebration of our resiliency is a part of and endemic to the Black culture. And that is open for everyone to understand and to engage in. We celebrate, we sing. In the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, we saw the Montgomery bus boycotts were kicking off and people were singing songs of resistance. This is something that is important to understand about Black culture, that it is a very celebratory space, that song and dance and culture are so important to us as we talk about the work of racial equity, often being a hard, challenging work. If we're going to be Black about it, we got to remember the barbecue that they had down there in Galveston, Texas. We've got to remember the songs, the dances that they did, the celebrations that they had, the family members that they welcomed in, the neighbors that they checked in on. We've got to remember that part because that is also what Juneteenth or Jubilee Day is about. When we get into the question of why did we need Juneteenth, I think it's important for us to contextualize that in the modern day. Juneteenth is a very important part of Black history in this country. And as Treasurer Frerichs noted, Abraham Lincoln, a native of the state of Illinois, was the one who signed that proclamation to ensure that African Americans who were still enslaved in the South and in some parts of the North were seen as free. The challenge with that, however, is that when we look today, we see 44 states are currently introducing or have passed legislation to restrict or ban what we are just talking about today, in an important part of Black history. We are seeing, as we talk about the question of how businesses interact with communities and how financial interests can sometimes be juxtaposed and in negative relationship to community interests. We have shareholders and financiers who are working against the work of equitable corporate governance by limiting or fighting to legislatively ban ESG, environmental, social, and governance regulations, as well as socially responsible investing. We see that Juneteenth has the possibility of becoming a commercial holiday rather than an American day of remembrance and centering of African descendants of enslaved people. We see the work of today where we're talking about the question of the rights that Black people have to get gainful employment or to be able to apply for a home. And we're seeing that affirmative action in this day, this very month, is being debated by our Supreme Court, and whether it will be repealed and pulled back, and all of the protections that specifically people of color and those who are classified under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 are protected by will be pulled back from the American economy and social landscape. You see, it is not just Juneteenth 1865 that is important. It is Juneteenth 2023. The day is here. The day is today. And this is why I'm so excited about AEBC. When I was first called in several years ago by Brian Eccles at the Illinois Treasurer's Office, and he asked me if I was interested in working with AEBC to facilitate these conversations with all of the banking partners, as well as to serve as a strategic thought partner to both of the Treasurer's offices, I jumped at the chance. You see, I've got a background in economics. That's what my degree is in. I also come from a father who was an entrepreneur, myself as an entrepreneur. I spent years and years and years studying economics. And the reality of the challenge of economics is even when I got my degree, when I went back to North Lawndale, where I grew up on the west side of Chicago, I didn't know how to actually help my community with anything I learned. All I knew how to do was to profit off my people. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a business that infused the realities of Black culture and the needs to fight against racial injustice and economic terror. But I never got a playbook for that when I was in school. And it's taken me nearly 20 years to piecemeal the learnings of how to do socially responsible business without a playbook, without a blueprint. But this is the reality of our time. And so when the Treasurer's offices confronted me and they said, hey, this is what we're working on. We want to look at a more urgent definition of racial equity in banking. We want someone who understands economics. They had known that I'd worked with CDFIs all across the country. We had started the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs, a coast-to-coast initiative to ensure that the banks, many of them who are here, who rely upon community development financial institutions to support some of the smaller lending and the technical assistance to small businesses and the opportunities to do more deeply entrenched in community responsive and engaged types of community engagement work, they entrust that into the CDFIs, and those types of institutions have always had a big place in my heart. And so this work of AEBC to start to join some of the intentions of specifically people of color with the work of people who were inside these banks who already said this is important. The thing that I love about AEBC is that we didn't have to convince anybody here that we need to be more specific about racial equity. We didn't have to drag anyone along or send along some talking points and these sorts of things. I walked into a space where there were professionals who were saying, hey, I got the job and I want these people to come too. That's an important part of the sustaining work of AEBC. That's an important part of the vision casting of our respective treasurer's offices, but it still means that there's work to do because they're only here and we're only here because the work is undone. We're only here because there's still more to do. And so let's talk a little bit about what happened in Juneteenth that gives us the work that we have today to do. So Juneteenth is not just about a call to memorialize the work and effort of Black people in 1865 as we fight and had fought for justice. It is very much about today. In 1862, when Abraham Lincoln signed that Emancipation Proclamation, it was because we were so divided about the value and humanity of Black people that America fought itself. We were so divided about the question of how America makes its money that this nation was willing to go to war within its own borders. And in 1863, when the proclamation went into effect, it still needed to be enforced. Everyone did not agree, and everyone did not comply. Southern states not only held slaves, but they maintained the unique form of American apartheid that made African Americans 3/5 of a human and unable to access basic resources to ensure a livable quality of life. Even our status as people, being only 60% human, was to ensure this tax opportunity that reinforced the importance of whiteness and the right of non-Black persons to profit from not only our bodies, but also our labor. And 2 years later, it took federal troops to march on Galveston, Texas to enforce that order. The value of Black bodies at that time, the insured value of Black bodies at that time was 80% of the entire Southern states' GDP. 80%. Upon being released, they were told to continue to work for hire by their slave masters, and they were provided no support to travel or to find stable employment or housing. They were released to this very dystopian landscape of laws, social norms, and racial caste actions that they would not be meaningfully released from for over 100 years. But today, when we think about that was then, what are the examples that we have today where we say the federal government has already said what our intentions for a more perfect union must be, but we still need better enforcement? And where Juneteenth is not just an example to consider where equity and inclusion can be important and solidify for Black persons, but for all types of people. The Equal Pay Act of 1973 provided a regulation that women were to be paid equally, but we know that the gender pay gap still exists. That needs to be better enforced. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, it required equity in lending, but we know, and we're gathered here today because that has still not been fully realized. The Community Reinvestment Act of 1977, it provided terms for lending to low to moderate income communities to combat the negative effects of redlining, which especially were felt and have been documented here in the city of Chicago. And in my own neighborhood of North Lawndale, nearly $3 billion of Black wealth in homes and in those home values, just in the span of 27 years between 1940 in 1967, $3 billion of wealth was extracted. And so as we continue to talk about how can we invest in Black communities, we need to talk about how can we repair what was divested. We invest when we're building on something that wasn't taken, but we repair that which was. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, it was supposed to ban discrimination in hiring. But clearly we see, when we look at tech companies and financial services and legal firms and medical communities, the realities of racial discrimination and a racially homogenous workplace are still present today. That needs to be better enforced, but there's no federal troops to march on Chicago and New York and Galveston and LA and these sorts of folks. You see, it would take us as individuals and as leaders to say, I will not wait for compliance. I will not wait for the government to set the terms of my integrity. I will not wait for someone else to say what the right thing to do is. We know it to be right, and we're going to do it right. This is what Juneteenth means. It means that we always have to be vigilant. We always have to be sensitive to the reality that this is not history. This is our modern opportunity. We have to remember that nothing about racial inequity is accidental. We design for inequity in the same way that we can design for equity. As an entrepreneur, I can tell you it is monumentally difficult to grow my consulting firm. And it's harder than most of my white entrepreneurial counterparts just to get contracts at market value from people who say they insist on a more racially just economy. I spent years when I was younger paying overdraft fees, while I was working at a hotel at the front desk making less than $30,000 a year. I paid monumental interest rates as I struggled to find affordable housing years ago and paid some of my month's rent on credit. I lived in a city that was fighting against affordable housing. I watched my father grow his social impact consulting firm, but never make it break even on any of his costs. And this is why we must not let laws determine our integrity or corporate compliance set the pace for our DEI and racial equity work. We have to imagine and be imaginative across all 4 areas of AEBC: the racial equity work, the lending work, the philanthropy and community investing, the DEI and talent recruiting, the mortgage lending, the commercial lending. We need to look at all of these areas and consider where can we imagine not for best practices, new practices. We need to better connect this ecosystem of bankers and appraisers and lenders and agents and the persons who are involved in real estate, because real estate is the largest wealth building vehicle in America, and small businesses are one of the most important parts of economic liberation for any racial group in the entire nation. We need more clear definitions for racial progress and everyone to adopt the narrative that justice and equity for those without historical protections and modern racial privileges are not the same as discrimination against those who have racial privilege. We need a philanthropic model that scales resources to our communities and focuses less on just giving back versus maintaining sustainable corporate models that don't take first. We need a real focus on the reason why financial services firms sometimes lack diversity and why lending to Black-owned businesses still trails white lending by a factor of nearly 6 to 1. We need everyone in on all of this. My last challenge to you all is to let your work start where your privilege starts. Wherever you see your privilege, start there. If you work in a diverse place and then go home to a segregated community, like much of Chicagoans do, start your work there, back home. You don't need to come to North Lawndale. Start right where you're at in Lincoln Park. Start right where you're at in River North. Start right where you're at in the Gold Coast. Start right where you're at and say, what can I do to promote and advance racial equity and inclusion here? Look around and ask yourself why the restaurant patrons all look the same in some parts of town and not the others, and whether those restaurateurs who were people of color were afforded the same terms as their white counterparts to open in those areas. Think about whether the lending rates and the terms, as we see interest rates of all types skyrocketing, whether persons of color are being afforded good terms for their ambitions and their goals and their desires to participate in our economy, or whether they're not. Let your work start where your privilege starts. That's the work of changing around the question of injustice, because if we can design for injustice, we can design for justice. We just need everybody all in. So I've said my piece. I want to bring in some of our other esteemed colleagues. Some of you all I've had the pleasure of working with and knowing in the past. I'm very excited. So I'm going to give just a very brief introduction of all of our panelists, and then I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves and to respond to our first question. So on our panel, we have the greatest, one of the legends, Thurman Tony Smith, the Senior Vice President, Territory Executive for Community Development Banking at PNC. Thank you so much, Tony, for being here. We are also joined by Doug Boersma, CEO of Wintrust Bank. We are joined by Donnell White, Senior Vice President for Regional Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Director at Huntington Bank. We are joined by Eric Smith, the Vice Chair at BMO Harris Bank. We are joined by Mike Quarles. Is Mike on the line? I don't think Mike's. No, I don't think Mike was able to make it. But we've got our panel here, so I want to jump in, folks, into our first question. The first question that I've got for you all is that, the AEBC report that was published a year ago, it identified 4 pillars of the industry. These are areas of industry where change was identified to be greatly needed to make a difference in eliminating systemic racism in banking. The four pillars were community investment, commercial lending, home lending, and talent acquisition and retention. So I'd love for each of you to give us a bit of background and context on what progress in any or all of these four pillars that your financial institution has made in the last year. Doug, can we start with you?
Certainly. Listen, first of all, I'd like to thank you guys for having Wintrust back and continuing our conversation from last year. This is a great use of all of our time. So as it relates to the four pillars, it's very similar to how we think about it internally at Wintrust. We're bankers by trade, and a lot of times we use statistics to determine how well our progress is. It's not always the best way to do it, but I'll jump around a little between the four pillars and just speak to some of the stats that we look at internally at Wintrust. In terms of community investment, over the course of the last year, we've made over $15 million in philanthropic donations to over 1,900 nonprofits throughout our organization. In terms of community investment, accessibility is super important to us and our clients. We have 33 locations, branch locations that cover the city of Chicago, of which 35% of those are in low to moderate income neighborhoods in Chicago. We've deployed over $120 million over the lifetime into our Chicago-based facilities, and have invested more than $70 million in a variety of different housing initiatives to both low and moderate income communities. Commercial lending within the Chicago footprint for us. In the past year, we originated 81 community development loans, which total over $43 million. And as you know, these CDL loans are focused on items as affordable housing, community service, and economic development. Moving into the home lending pillar, which is very important to us. And Xavier, you mentioned it in your opening remarks. In the past 2 years, we've provided over 5,500 mortgages in the city of Chicago itself. And of those 5,500, 36% were to borrowers with below moderate income levels. So something we're very proud of. And as it relates to the fourth pillar, talent acquisition and retention, always work to be done. We always set the bar higher each year. But over the course of the last several years, we've had a 50% increase in our leaders of color and a 35% increase in our female leaders. And we define leadership as vice president above. And when we do that by prioritizing, we want to hire people in the communities that we serve. And so we start there, but also have a variety of mentoring, sponsorship programs that our senior leadership is very involved with, that we think has been the pull and part of the success of our statistics.
Thanks so much, Doug.
Yeah.
Donnell, would you like to add your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Xavier. One, for setting the foundation. I agree. This is certainly a celebration. I appreciate your leadership and setting the tone for today. And to the treasurers, thank you for your leadership. Leadership definitely matters. And what better day than to have a conversation about empowering our communities. And so to the question regarding the pillars and how Huntington Bank has stepped up to the challenge, we announced a 5-year, $40 billion community investment strategy. Our strategic community plan reflects our commitment to strengthen small businesses and foster economic justice in under-resourced communities. Underlining that $40 billion commitment is our racial and social equity commitment. At the core of this strategic plan is our emphasis on DEI and our inclusion initiatives. Of the $40 billion that was committed, Huntington has dedicated $16 billion in loans and investments to establish programs and services that fosters equity in areas such as affordable housing, small business financing, and community services. Within the small business sector, Huntington expanded its small business lending programs into its new footprint and committed $10 billion over 5 years. $2 billion, which is focused in lending to business owners from diverse backgrounds. Through 2022, we've lent $4.4 billion with approximately $1.2 billion in diverse census tracts. As it relates to home and consumer lending, we're committed to providing $24 billion in affordable mortgage lending. And again, this is over the 5-year term of our commitment to our strategic plan. So under home and consumer lending, we committed $24 billion in affordable mortgage lending, of which $12 billion is committed to meeting the needs of diverse and under-resourced populations. And through 2022, we were at $10.5 billion, with $6 billion being in diverse census tracts. With community development lending and investment, we're again dedicated to increasing the availability of capital to historically under-resourced people, businesses, and communities. And through 2022, under our plan, we've invested $4.7 billion with just over $700 billion in diverse census tracts. That puts us about halfway to our goal. Much more work to do. Treasurer, I think it was you that said that we've achieved a lot, but have so much more to go. And we couldn't agree with you more. Last year, we did waived 12 million closing costs for buyers in low to moderate income regions. We continue to be the #1 originator of SBA loans in the nation for the 5th consecutive year. We have very unique programs like our Lift Local, which launched in October of 2020, where we provided $70 million in funding to more than 1,000 minority women and veteran-owned small businesses. Of that $70 million, about $28 million was directed to Black and Hispanic-owned businesses. We started a new opportunity with our Senior Vice President and Multicultural Banking Director, Nancy Spencer, who's right there on the ground in Chicago, who's looking to fully connect and amplify our diverse customer relationships to empower and unleash their potential, maximize growth opportunity, and strengthen brand and attract, develop, attain, and retain diverse talent. And to the question of talent acquisition, it's important to note you can't hire your way to diversity. How we engage, develop, and retain and attract talent of all backgrounds reflects the realities of our marketplace and our communities and the relevant labor market. It's evident by our HBCU and our HSU strategy. It's evident by the KPIs that we have, that we hold our executive leadership team accountable to. Our CEO is engaged and has high line of sight. The most notable is that we are looking to achieve 50% of diversity by the end of 2023 for our senior leadership. Currently, we're at 47%. And the others is how we load the pipeline, from diverse slates to pay equity to succession planning, internal hiring, and promotions. And so talent acquisition remains at the forefront of all that we do as well.
Donnell, thanks so much for those updates. Those are really exciting. I'd love to call in Tony. Tony, are you, can you provide us with your thoughts on what's happening at PNC?
Sure. And, I like to open, with this observation. When we started on this journey, I don't think any of us anticipated that we would have stagflation, or this combination of high inflation, low GDP, and yet still have remarkably high employment. And one that we can particularly note is shared among African Americans, and women in particular have shown remarkable resilience in this economy. And yet, despite this, PNC is among those banks that actually made a strategic acquisition. In our case, the U.S. assets, BBVA, and with that, we entered an $88 billion community benefits plan. I'm delighted to say that in the first year alone, we already executed and delivered over $35 billion under that plan. And primarily in those 3 pillars, those which include, of course, affordable housing, all the various forms of small business and economic development, and then, of course, what we call community financing, which is that more broad spectrum of all the things we do to make communities stronger and better. And Treasurer Ervin, Conyears-Ervin, I recall that, when you and I first shared a stage, we were talking about creating entrepreneurs. And I made the observation that we can't just teach people to fish. We should help them buy a boat. I was corrected recently at a graduation for Sunshine Enterprises, where someone says, "No, don't help me buy a boat. Help me buy a fleet. Help me go public. Help me grow my business to scale." And in that observation is this notion that as banks, we can't just help grow small business. We have to help brown and black and other communities of color grow their businesses to scale. And it's an important part of where we're focused. When we look at numbers, the numbers for the past year were remarkable in that we had over 25 billion, deployed in supporting LMI home ownership, that we had another 4.8 billion for small business, and those are two remarkable numbers, again, despite what was going on in the economy. At the same time, we launched our minority business development group, which specifically aimed to put boots on the ground, people who look and talk like us, remembering that we also have a very large Latino population. So those empresas pequeñas are also important to us as well. And again, the numbers look good, but more importantly, it's what do we see going forward? How are we helping to build resilience for a recession? And Xavier, I think it was implied in your observations that when recession happens, it tends to have a disproportionately more devastating impact on low to moderate income communities of color. And so it's in that respect that we are very aggressively looking at how the policies we deploy are going to help those communities be more resilient, and how are we giving them powers to grow and sustain. And so by way of example, we launched a new initiative that essentially says we're going to identify minority developers as a subsegment of all developers and provide not just debt, but equity, help them to acquire and compete for inventory, develop product that they can convert into either for sale or into rental housing, help our developers participate in the incredible opportunity of being developers in a robust market. We've also wrote out in our minority business strategy, we put people on the ground throughout our footprint with this idea that we have to have the conversations with our community leaders to accomplish one principal thing, and that is move away from peddling product to solving problems. And so much of what we're doing today is also listening and then quickly deploying solutions that get at real problems. But I'm going to pause here. I know you have a lot of other questions, and I want to be sensitive to time.
No, thank you for that, Tony. I'm especially, the remark you made about the supporting entrepreneurs and business owners to scale. That is so important. I think there's so many $5,000 grant opportunities out there, and people who have $50,000 to $100,000 monthly burn rates, who are people of color, don't really need 5K. They have a functioning business. They need scale. Last but not least, I wanted to bring in Eric, but I think that he just hopped out. So I'm going to bring Eric back in a little bit later. So gents, we're going to go on to our second question for now. My second question is really in response to where we're at in the economy right now, and where we're at in the social felt experience of having a focus and keeping a focus on the work of racial equity and DEI. Increasingly, we are in what many are calling a racial equity and DEI recession. Many of the companies that were explicit about racial equity in 2020, they are clearly backing off from those promises. Nearly a third of all DEI staff at companies in the Fortune 500 and in the NASDAQ have been fired in the past 9 months. Investments in explicitly anti-racist programming have been nearly shattered. I can just personally say that as someone who conducts workplace trainings, upskilling, and as an executive coach to a lot of companies around the country, the demand for this type of work has absolutely plummeted. And so I'm curious from you all, because it's not just the demand for the work needs to be there, the application of the impact that we need from the work is what the work is supposed to be generating. And so I'm curious, how are you keeping traction or even leading right now during what is now known as this DEI and racial equity recession. And Eric, I know you got cut off a little bit, so I would love for you to jump in, and if you'd like to start with letting us know with what's happening at BMO, and then moving into the question, that would be great.
Sure. Xavier, thank you. And thanks to Treasurer Conyears-Ervin and to Treasurer Frerichs as well for this very important discussion. It's a pleasure to be here with my other panelists. We are really excited at BMO to have a strong commitment to building a more just society. And so to address your specific question around our commitment to DE&I, we're looking to really make sure that we can address those issues that have been part of the systemic barriers that have presented obstacles for Black, Latinos, and Native Americans, and for other communities that have not had the opportunities to advance within their career and banking. And so in 2020, we announced our own initiative that was BMO Zero Barriers to Entry over a 5-year period. We laid out very public commitments for what we wanted to do in terms of both internal and external DE&I initiatives. And I'm pleased to share that our corporate board is comprised of 50% women, and of our senior leadership team, roughly 42% of our leaders are women, and then 25% are people of color. As many of you may know, our very esteemed U.S. CEO, Dave Casper, announced his retirement just this spring after 46 years here at BMO. And I'm very proud that his successor that was named is my friend and colleague, Daryl Hackett, who was one of the first African Americans to lead a U.S. bank. And so our commitment is important. And I think it speaks not only to the fact that Daryl is an African American, but a talented banker who understands the importance of first-class banking in a first-class way, and understanding that through the lens of DE&I. As it relates to some of our other commitments for increasing the pipeline, I'm also proud that roughly 40% of our BMO student opportunities are to targeted members from the BIPOC community. We have a very active outreach to HBCUs and to majority schools as well, to make sure that we can continue to increase the pipeline of diverse talent here. And that's also complemented by many of the internal programs that we offer. I think to the first question that many of my colleagues have had a chance to share, and I congratulate them on the tremendous work that they're leading. We're proud that here at BMO, our mission is to boldly grow the good in business and life. And we're honored to have served as one of the founding members of the AEBC initiative. And as part of that, when we launched this in 2020, it was right around the time of the pandemic, and we saw the tragic killing of George Floyd. And we recognized the need to make sure that we were intentional on providing access to capital. And we launched our own initiative, BMO Empower, which is a $5 billion 5-year commitment. We thought that it would take us 5 years, but within just 2 years, we deployed over $6 billion. And so just earlier this year, we announced our own $40 billion commitment that basically used the same framework to make sure that we were deploying capitals, focusing on community development and neighborhood revitalization, supporting small businesses, and also mortgage lending and low to moderate income communities. Also making sure that our supplier diversity efforts were part of this very important effort to support diverse vendors across the spectrum as part of our own supply chain, and then our philanthropic efforts. So we're really excited to be able to make sure that we're ensuring that we're providing an access to capital, but that we're investing in our communities and supporting small businesses to help promote a thriving economy across all of the markets that we serve.
Thank you so much, Eric. Doug, would love to hear from you about what your perception is right now of this market, and we're talking about this racial equity and DEI recession, and where your leadership at Wintrust is looking to either meet where others are not at, or perhaps even lead in this work.
Yeah, listen, it's a great question, and I, the easy way to say it, it's always top of mind for us. It's always a discussion topic. We have a dedicated DEI team that we established several years ago that over the course of the last year has grown by 33% internally, but also recognize that the DEI team is not driving all of our progress. We have the expectation that all of our employees are held accountable during their performance evaluations and things of that nature to the entire DEI effort. We've created over the course of the last few years 5 business resource groups or BRGs in various capacities: leadership coalition, career navigation, a multicultural professional network, an organization that we call PRISM that's in support of the LGBTQ plus community. And over the course of this last year, established a Women of Wintrust coalition. So it's something that's top of mind for us at all points. Everybody's held accountable. And again, it's something that we don't let out of our conversations at all. We gather probably our 80 top business unit leaders throughout the organization twice a year for an executive diversity forum. And again, for us, it's just constantly metricing how we're doing and making sure that every business line and every employee is responsible for the effort.
Thanks so much, Doug. Donnell, would love to hear your thoughts on what you're seeing as it relates to this racial equity and DEI recession and some of the sort of the pullbacks from some of the companies around the country, and what Huntington Bank sees in this, and where you all see yourselves matching or leading in the work. Oh, I think Donnell might be frozen.
Xavier, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
I think you were going in and out there. Hopefully, can you hear me? Good?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a little
Yeah,
choppy, but we can hear you.
Thanks again for okay. Thanks again for the opportunity. It's all about commitment. When many down, Huntington is doubling down on our commitment to DEI. Over the past 24 months, our DEI team has doubled in size. Our chief DEI and culture officer now reports to our CEO and is our executive leadership team. We've increased our departmental budget capacity over the past 12 months. Our DEI networks, that's our business resource groups and inclusion councils, where 25% of our colleague population to our affinity groups. We established our DEI strategic DEI and culture officer, which engages our executive and senior leaders in the company. And we are redefining what it means to be a leader at Huntington and becoming an inclusive leader. We recently launched our executive DEI training, where our top 300 leaders within the company will become certified diversity professionals accredited. So that's exciting. We've continued to highlight the business imperative. To us, there is no mystery why we continue to see great quarters while at the same time becoming the most diverse company, more reflective of the communities that we serve than we have ever been. Meeting our shareholders' expectations, managing and mitigating risk, and adhering to industry regulations at the same time.
Thank you so much, Donnell. Tony, would you like to round us off about what's happening?
Sure. Happy to join in, and I really like the way Doug opened and framed this for us, and I think it's probably true for most of the major banks around town. First of all, let's be very clear: talent retention sits front and center today, and while we certainly aren't immune to losses, we have invested heavily in a retention strategy. And what we found at the core of this was a very simple observation: experience matters, not just the subject matter expertise or competencies of the people we have deployed, but we found that the experience of our clients, the experience of the individual who is asked to do the work. How do you feel about the work every day? And in the course of creating our own EBRGs, we went one step further, and we've created executive forums where we have all of the most senior African Americans and all of the most senior Latinos in particular, creating two: one, our African American Forum, our Latinos Forum, which is also called UNIDOS, And we're asking the tough questions. What do we have to do to retain you and keep you and help you continue to migrate up the opportunity ladder? You have to be very intentional about those kinds of conversations and the strategies behind that to make sure that the talent we want isn't unintentionally inhibited from opportunity. And it takes a lot of time and it costs a lot of money, obviously, to do this, but we're doing it and we're doing it well. And the consequences, if you look at our African-American employees at the SVP rank and higher, over 2 years, it's almost doubled. It's really grown in remarkable ways. The head of our corporate responsibility department, Richard Bynum, African-American. The new head of our retail system, Jeff Martinez, Latino. The head of community development, Ray Ocañas, Latino. It's a remarkable new face on PNC, and we're making or bringing to life this commitment to having people of color in senior most roles in our organization, but equally important, creating a definitive strategy for developing that talent so that there is a observable pathway to the senior most leadership opportunities in our company. It takes work, still more to do, but absolutely making the experience good and making it intentional has been pivotal for us in realizing this new chapter.
Thanks so much, Tony. This next question is a little bit off the cuff, y'all. So y'all didn't get this one, but I'm realizing that in our conversation, people could misinterpret the work of ensuring that, particularly at senior levels, you have diverse representation, you have people of color represented. They can interpret that as just a gimme, as if we're not talking about qualified persons. They can interpret that as just a numbers game. So I'd love for you all to kind of talk about, how do you articulate the value of diverse leadership in your institution, so that people understand that this isn't about just finding Black people or brown people to fit roles. This is really about the work of perhaps repair, the work of bringing qualified folks, etc.
Well, I'll
Tony,
hop in first this time instead of going last. And I'll say this. If we use Chicago as an example, and you look at how our business has grown, it would not have grown to the extent that it has if we had not been successful in, by way of example, tapping to and intentionally growing our Latino business segment. Now you see PNC with, aligned with names like Esperanza Health Center, with Hispanic housing, with a growing number of organizations like La Casa Norte. It was intentional, but it took recognizing that, quite frankly, a diverse staff is good for business. So it wasn't something we just did because it looked nice. It was a great business choice that is paying off. And so it gives us, again, we talk about that pathway to developing our talent that is executing not just philosophically, but economically. It matters. And I think as we learn that lesson, we realize this isn't an option. This is a must do if we're going to be successful in this business. And it just happens, and for very good reasons, that it's also the good thing to do and the right thing to do. So I think when you are able to marry this recognition of doing the right thing with business sensibility, you see something remarkable. And I believe in so doing, something sustainable.
Thanks so much, Tony. Doug, I see you look like you're itching to get in.
I'm just agreeing with my colleague. Listen, we look at it a lot of different ways, and we hold ourselves accountable. I talk about the metrics all the time, and we sit with our board on a quarterly basis and go over all sorts of statistics of how well or how not well we're doing. We talk about management or upper level as VP and all that stuff. We've really taken a step back over the course of the last 2 years. And so we have to build a better bench, right? And we've spent a lot of time being very successful in the marketplace of hiring diverse talent. But we also have to recognize that we have to build a bench. So even though it's not quote unquote senior leadership, we have statistics that we put around our training program where we want 50% diversity in the young professionals that we're hiring out of college. That's super important to build the future for us. And we even go down into our partnerships externally of the people. When we opened a facility in North Lawndale, we talked about it quite a bit last year, a few years back, and it was about getting into that community, hiring people in that community, having partnerships with the external people in those communities. And so again, that just builds the right metrics over the course of the lower levels of our business and the higher levels of our business.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Doug. I'm going to move on to our third question today, and this one is really asking you all to kind of imagine with us, so dream with me a little bit. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of activity happening to advance economic racial equity, but the conditions in many communities of color, they're not just bad. They're in many places they're actually deteriorating. In the city of Chicago, for example, Chicago has 2.7 million people. Nearly 400,000 Black Chicagoans have left the region, the metro Chicago area, since the year 2000. Nearly 400,000 have left or been displaced because of housing, their housing being destroyed. Whitewashing is a term that we use in the mortgage and lending space, where the value of a home is appraised to be less if you're a person of color than if you are white. And whitewashing, we're finding documented, is still to be fairly rampant across the lending sector. Housing prices and the cost of a loan are exponentially higher. I was just looking to see that the average rate on a 30-year mortgage is now about 6.7%, which is nearly double or so what it was just 2 years ago. And major companies, when we talk about hiring and retention, there's not significant traction. In some sectors, for instance, like tech, there's no company that's a part of the FANG stocks that has more than 10% black population in that company. They've had these goals since around the year 2014. So it's not just that there's a lot of activity. There's this question of traction that I think we really need to be clear-eyed about and ask ourselves, what are the specific activities we're doing and how do we increase traction? So I'd love to hear from you all. What are some of the ideas you have? What are some of the ideas you have about different and innovative solutions that perhaps you're doing or perhaps you want to get to as it relates to this? Donnell, I'd love for you to kick us off.
Sure. Xavier, I recall back to the oh no, hopefully you can hear me there. It was suggested I might need to go off of camera for bandwidth, so we'll try that. But hopefully you can still hear me.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking back to the AEBC 2022 final report, and it talked about community investment and an absence of partnership, and that banks needed to act as community partners more. And by way of example, we've launched what we call our DEI summits. And I was born in Chicago. I still have lots of family in Chicago, so I know the plight that Chicago is experiencing. But you can replace Chicago with pretty much any urban center, across our nation and have a similar narrative. But we've sought to create what we call our DEI summits in partnerships with the local communities. We're very regionally focused, and in partnership with Chris Sweetland, our regional president there in the Chicago market. We are excited to announce our June DEI Summit on June 27th in the Chicago market, where we're having a very intentional conversation about building wealth and empowering homeowners. We'll gather community experts, share ideas and programs that they're doing towards housing equity in the community, specifically around the housing appraisal process and home buying experience. We're excited to partner with Home Action Illinois, Chicago Urban League, Fannie and Mae and Freddie Mac, NHS, Woodstock, Spanish Coalition for Housing. So again, back to banks not taking this journey alone and solely seeking to put dollars behind the problem, but where are we empowering organizations that are on the ground? Leaders who are doing the work becomes a huge imperative for us as we look forward. So we continue to look forward to gaining insights on how we can better support these existing efforts and or new concepts that are created during the summit, and exciting to look forward to opportunities to fund and continue the great work that's happening on the ground there in the Chicago market.
Awesome. Thank you. Convening, I think, is so important. And I love that you pulled in some of the recommendations from the AEBC report. I just want to remind everyone who's listening, you can find that report online if you just Google AEBC Report 2022, and you'll find it there. Eric, would love to hear from you about some of the ideas that BMO's either trying or that you personally may come in with your expertise and say, hey, here's what I think we can do to increase traction.
Sure. No, thanks for the opportunity. And one of the things that I'm really excited to share is that just this morning, we announced a new home ownership assistance program to help buyers get their first time mortgage. And I think that's something that all of us are doing, but we have to continue to lean in because really home ownership is one of the biggest barriers to creating wealth and what drives the racial wealth gap that exists. Our program, which we announced in partnership with the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, allows for a $6,000 down payment assistance, and when combined with other programs, can offer up to $20,000 of down payment assistance. And we really believe that that's an opportunity for us, again, to help folks have that American dream of home ownership. But it's not just providing the assistance, it's making sure that we're investing in communities. When our former mayor Lightfoot announced her Invest Southwest initiative, BMO was one of the first corporate partners to support with a $10 million commitment. We're really excited that just last month, we were in the Austin community, which is the neighborhood that we have adopted, to really help to lend that support around community development. And so we were there to help Aspire launch their new center. Many of you know that represented an elementary school that had been closed and abandoned there that left a real blight in the community. Not only are we supporting the Aspire Center, but we're going to put a branch there in that center to make sure that we can partner with ITW that's coming along to provide a warehouse facility and job creation to make sure that we're partnering from a civic and private public sector perspective to support communities like that really need our investment because they've been left behind for far too long. We're looking at ways to make sure that we can continue to lean in on supporting small businesses because we know that they continue to provide the majority of the jobs in those communities. I'm really excited by the work that Cecilia Cuff and Eric Williams have done in launching Bronzeville Winery. That was a new restaurant establishment that had gone to over 20 different banks in Chicago looking for financing. And when they came to BMO, our team, while we're not overly excited about the restaurant sector, particularly during the COVID environment, we were excited about what Bronzeville Winery was bringing to the Bronzeville community, something that was a cherished opportunity to make sure that they brought the rich culture of their flavor that comes from Mississippi and from South Carolina and from other parts of our country, to be able to make sure that the residents of Bronzeville don't have to drive downtown or somewhere far, far away, but that they can have fine dining right in their own community, and that they can also look to that establishment for providing jobs and for supporting the community over the future to be a vibrant community. So those are things that I think are very important. We've touched on areas that we need to also focus on around appraisals, and I think that it will be very important for us to address that and partnering with organizations that bring diverse appraisers that are able to make sure that we really tackle those systemic issues that have held us back for far too long in the housing sector.
Eric, thanks so much for that. I think that, organizations and restaurateurs like, Bronzeville Winery are absolutely pivotal. When we think about wineries and where to go on a date or to, even for Justice Informed, because we were their first corporate partner to host an event at Bronzeville Winery before they had even opened up. It's so pivotal because as a Black person, I love wine. I love going out hobnobbing, but there was no place I could go. For the most part on the South Side. And there's still, to this day, on the West Side, very few places that I can go. So I encourage y'all to keep supporting those visions and places for people of color to recreate and as well to engage financially with them, with their own communities. Doug, we'd love to have you come in and tell us a bit about what you see as opportunities for activities that create more traction.
Yeah, as we head into kind of the final section of our session here, I certainly want to acknowledge and congratulate my panelists here on what their institutions have accomplished. I think it's at the forefront of what all of our organizations are thinking about. But as we all know, we have to set the bar higher. We have to avoid repeating mistakes that we've made in the past. But I get a great sense of, all of the panelists on the phones, we slug it out every day on loans and deposits and all those things. But, in many, many respects, this is a lot more important over the long haul. So again, I just want to acknowledge and congratulate my peers here. As far as we think about it, it's, it goes back to our knitting of partnership. And, as we all of the folks on the phone talk about big transactions a lot, we do too. Home runs, right? They make your budget, they make your month, your quarter, whatever. But for us, it's more about singles. So it's getting into our communities, it's establishing those partnerships with the right people externally, which leads to just more strength of who we're hiring internally. Again, for us, it's about strategically looking at what we do next. As a community-based bank in Chicago, we're constantly thinking of what's our next step, what's our next branch, and our track record shows that 35% of our Chicago footprint is in low to moderate income tracks. And so for us, it's just thinking about the small things like that, not the big things that sometimes make a good quarter or make a good month. So again, I think Eric touched too on being strategic. They had just launched a new program. We have a program that provides financing, pledge of closing costs to first-time home buyers, whether it's a Wintrust-based loan or one of our competitors-based loans. So it's always trying to be thinking about the singles for us.
Thanks for that, Doug. All right, Tony, you're rounding us out with our panel today. What's your response to this action?
This and what a great topic, and I feel like Doug could have written my speech because I feel like I'm a full right into his comments again. But I'm gonna say three things. We made some decisions here. First, on an opportunity zone fund, we made a decision to only deploy those monies on low to moderate income census tracts and in projects that primarily benefit low to moderate income peoples. Two, we made a decision that, and a recognition of the fact that we don't do it alone. And Xavier, you talked about CDFIs and African-American and led CDFIs, and we expanded our commitment to include another $400 million in commitments to CDFIs, precisely because we know they are getting at communities that too frequently go underserved. We also recognize that we have partners like Self-Help Credit Union here in Chicago and elsewhere that, like so many banks in the wake of what happened over the last 6 months, were not able to necessarily attract the levels of deposits needed. So we made a decision to invest deposits in our CDFI banks so that they too could remain resilient and understand that resilience also means resilient to all the government testing that requires their tier 1 and tier 2 capital levels to stay at certain levels. And so we're doing that. In fact, we've gone beyond that to also gift to some of our CDFI banks branches that we had closed. We made a decision to provide all types of what you would call the banking services that we provide to other banks so that they could compete in this highly technology-driven environment. We also recognize that it is very easy to let fear guide all of your credit practice when you anticipate a recession. One, by the way, we've been waiting for forever, but it hasn't come yet. And I'm not going to make any bets on that, Doug. I have no idea, but I will say this. We in the back of our minds, you can observe it in what's happening in generally in the economy. Banks have pulled back a bit, and that has some consequences. But we can't do so and find ourselves unintentionally harming low to moderate businesses of color. So it's why we have continued to to be very, very intentional about looking at all of those decisionings that affect the credit availability that low to moderate income communities of color endure in a time like this. So I'm gonna pause. I know you're close to time. We could talk for another 20 hours later, Xavier, but love the work that you, our treasurers, are doing, and look forward to being a part of this continuing conversation.
Thanks so much, Tony. The last thing I wanted to say before I pass this off for closing remarks from our city treasurer is that we did have two other panelists. I just want to make sure that they are named because they contribute so much to AEBC and they were looking to be a part of this panel today, but due to technical reasons with Wi-Fi and firewalls inside some of the banks, they weren't able to join us today, but I want to make sure that they get a shout out. So Jackie Robinson-Ivy, who's the Senior Vice President for Intergovernmental Affairs at Northern Trust, as well as Michael Quarles, Managing Director, Head of Diverse Business Strategies at JP Morgan Chase. Thank you both as individuals and to your institutions for participating in AEBC. With that said, thank you also, gentlemen, for participating in the panel. And I want to hand it off for closing remarks to our city treasurer.
All righty. I tell you, this has been extremely informative. I have learned so much today. We've been doing this. We said this is our third panel that we have done, but it seems like each and every year I learn even more of what is going on in our banking institutions. And I have to tell you, Xavier, you did an awesome job today facilitating this panel, and it's truly a showing of what you all do at Justice Informed. So thank you very much for not only the education that you provided, but the way you facilitated the panel on today. And I must certainly thank our panel that really have shown that they are putting in the work to make Chicago a more equal, a more equitable city. And this commission, the Advancing Equity in Banking Commission, as we mentioned, it really began on Juneteenth and will continue to be tied to Juneteenth because it's a day of both acknowledging that all Americans have not always been free, but that we are still not treated equally and there is more work to do. So unfortunately, unfair lending practices have kept Black and Brown Americans from purchasing homes, reducing generational wealth. So many of our Americans today still have 70% of less net wealth than their non-minority neighbors. And unequal investing priorities have really built up, unfortunately, other neighborhoods, while Black and Brown neighborhoods have struggled with vacant properties. And because of this history, many people of color do not trust our financial system. So when I became city treasurer, it was truly a dream to do things differently. And 2020 only further highlighted how necessary it was to make that transformational change. And that's why I'm glad to have joined State Treasurer Michael Frerichs to launch this commission that will do more than just highlight the disparities in banking. We wanted to implement solutions. And certainly all the panelists that came on board examined their work to see what changes they can do and should, and they really jumped in to make this a more leveling playing field. And I really want to make a note of who joined us today. They are putting their money where their mouths are. And I heard so many today mention billions of dollars in investments in underserved communities. I heard billions of dollars mentioned several times. This is why we bring these discussions to residents, because we want to educate you on what is out there and what is available. Now, I think about the panel that we have that I'm looking at today. I can probably walk, while maybe a long walk, but I can actually walk to two branches that I can recall just quickly at Wintrust. I can walk to two branches while they continue to open branches in our community while other banks are closing branches. And when we talk about our initiatives within the Chicago Treasurer's Office, I focus a lot on financially empowering residents. BMO is always the first to say they want to be a premier sponsor. And we heard from Huntington today, who really spoke about how they do a lot in expanding community lending, but they talk about affordable lending. And they work a lot with our office. They reach out to us all the time on their initiatives, inviting us to be a partner with them, because community lending is great, but it must be affordable. And PNC Bank, I'll close on this, certainly is another bank within our community that is relevant, that is prevalent, and they work with us all the time. And while I know Xavier mentioned Northern Trust and Chase, unfortunately, technology even today restricted them from joining us, but we want to thank them for being a part of the commission, being a part of the team. This is a team effort. And certainly Chicagoans in all corners of our city deserve to have the same access to loans and mortgages and the same opportunity to succeed. And so we expect even greater progress on these goals that the banks have set for themselves. And we meet with these banks regularly. I want you all to know. But the reason that we had this publicly is because we are holding them accountable. But what I like is that they are holding themselves accountable. And so I certainly want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank our staff, by the way, and I know I'm going to ask Treasurer Frerichs to jump in as well to give his closing comments, but a special thanks to our staff, the staff of the Chicago Treasurer's Office. Robbie Scott has really been leading this for us. And then Brian Echols from the State Treasurer's Office. They do a really great job. And I have to really especially put a note out here because Robbie Scott is going on to do bigger and better things. And so she will be leaving the Treasurer's Office in about a week or so. So we certainly want to especially thank her for the work that she has done. And by the way, Treasurer Frerichs, we did not know that the twins came early. Congratulations. You're still awake somehow on this panel. And certainly welcome back home, as I know you just moved back to Chicago. At this time, State Treasurer Michael Frerichs.
Well, thank you, Treasurer Conyears-Ervin. Yes, I am awake right now. I may need a nap later this afternoon, but there is a lot of work left to be done. I figure by the time they're teenagers, I can sleep. I want to thank you for your partnership. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this very important Juneteenth conversation. The Advancing Equity in Banking Commission was brought together to work collectively to address decades of systemic barriers and economic exclusion. We have come together to challenge each other, to inspire each other, and to identify solutions to fill in gaps that have impeded financial progress for all. As this is only our fourth convening, obviously there is more work to do. And while we've not solved these challenges, we certainly are making strides in the right direction. Earlier, I asked our banking leaders to dream with us as treasurers. It is my hope that we as leaders in the financial space will dream so big that we continue to solve the challenges created by systemic barriers that have existed for decades. We dream a world where all people can live in communities that are financially vibrant and safe to raise their families and pass on generational wealth. It's been said before, and I certainly agree, that if one of us is not free, then none of us are really free. Juneteenth is about freedom. And each of us holds a key to that freedom. As the state treasurer, I will continue to do what is in my power to get resources into communities that have been left out or left behind. The programs offered by my office address the financial needs of the people of Illinois. From our 529 college savings plans for children to our Secure Choice program for those planning for retirement. We look forward to continuing to build an equitable future for all Illinoisans, and we look forward to doing it all with all of you, our Banking Commission partners. So my apologies if I had to go off camera a couple of times today. I had you guys on loud volume, but because of this move, I had some contractors I had to let in, but I was glad you could all join us. And for those who couldn't make it on the video, I know you were listening in, and thank you for your partnership. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and happy Freedom Day. Xavier, I turn it over to you to adjourn this meeting.
Thank you so much, Treasurer Frerichs, and happy Father's Day. Twins.
Yes, happy Father's Day. Thank you.
I got my
we don't want to forget that
last week.
Yeah, it was a big Father's Day for you, I'm sure. Everyone, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this work. When people ask me, how do I define justice? I say it's the work of simultaneously repairing harm that has been done, empowering the people who have been the victim of it, imagining new ideas and solutions for the future, and committing to long-term investments that sustain them. It's the real work that I believe corporate America can and should embrace. It's beyond just equality. It's beyond just fairness. It's a comprehensive matter of understanding and acknowledgement and affirming and really repairing, as well as imagining what's possible. So thank you all for doing this work with us. I look forward to seeing how this work grows. I know that AEBC is also looking to transition its model and change the way it does its work, both to convene our banks, but also to engage our communities who need not just financial empowerment, they need financial repair and racial equity at the same time. So thank you especially to the treasurer's offices of the city of Chicago, as well as the state of Illinois. I want to thank everyone who's listening, and I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful, safe day.
Bye, everybody.